The night everyone said I destroyed Victoria Langford's mansion, I was not holding the controls of anything. I was standing beside a sheriff, a county inspector, and a stack of court papers while a licensed demolition crew removed the part of her house she had been warned about for years. That was the thought running through my mind as bright work lights washed across the rear wing of Victoria's hillside mansion, turning the white stone walls gold against the dark Arizona sky. The crew moved slowly, carefully, and professionally, following the marked lines approved by the county earlier that afternoon. Sheriff Daniel Reeves stood near the driveway with his hands folded in front of him, not there to punish anyone, not there to choose sides, but simply to make sure the lawful order was carried out without confusion. Across the circular drive, Victoria stood beside her attorney wearing a bright emerald designer blazer, oversized jewelry, and a silk scarf that looked impossibly expensive even under construction lights. She was heavy-set, polished, and still carried herself like a woman who had spent years expecting every room to organize itself around her voice. But for the first time since I had known her, she was not giving orders. She was watching them be carried out. My name is Caleb Whitmore, and 3 weeks earlier, I had no idea any of this was coming. I owned a stone mansion on the far edge of Marigold Hills, an upscale desert community outside Scottsdale where every driveway curved through manicured gravel. Every roofline seemed approved by committee, and every sunset made the mountains look painted. I bought the property because it sat on a private 5-acre lot, separated from the tighter residential streets by a dry wash, natural desert landscaping, and a long iron gate that made the place feel quiet without feeling isolated. The house itself was not flashy by Marigold Hill standards. It was large, yes, but it had been designed by a local architect, approved by the county, inspected through every construction stage, and completed long before I moved in. I had all the files because the previous owner was the kind of man who kept permits in labeled folders and warranty papers in plastic sleeves. For 2 years, I lived there without any serious issue. I paid my dues, maintained the property, kept the exterior exactly as approved, and ignored most neighborhood politics because I had no interest in arguing about mailbox finishes or driveway lighting. That changed on a Thursday afternoon when a sheriff's deputy arrived at my gate with an envelope from the Marigold Hills Homeowners Association. He was polite, professional, and made it clear he was only serving a civil notice, not making any judgment about whether the contents were valid. The envelope contained a formal demand signed by Victoria Langford, the HOA president. According to the letter, my mansion violated community architectural standards due to an alleged unauthorized rear terrace, altered stonework, and landscaping that supposedly extended into a protected drainage corridor. The demand gave me 2 choices: pay a massive fine and submit a demolition plan for the disputed features, or face further enforcement action from the association. The phrase that caught my attention was written in bold across the second page: pay or remove. It was not a court order. It was not a county order. It was an HOA demand written as if Victoria personally controlled every inch of private property in Marigold Hills. I stood in my driveway reading the letter twice while the deputy waited by his vehicle. When I asked whether the sheriff's office had inspected anything, he shook his head and said, "Sir, we are only delivering the paperwork. You will want to speak with an attorney before responding." That was the best advice I heard all week. I thanked him, walked back inside, and opened the file cabinet where every permit, inspection record, survey, architectural approval, and county certificate for my home had been stored since closing day. By sunset, my dining room table was covered in documents proving that the features Victoria wanted removed had been approved years earlier. At first, I thought the issue would be simple. I would send copies, correct the misunderstanding, and return to my quiet life. Then I noticed something strange in the county packet. Tucked behind an old drainage map was a highlighted note about a separate property on the upper ridge, a property owned by Victoria herself. The note did not accuse anyone of anything, but it referenced an unresolved review involving a rear expansion near protected desert land. I remember staring at that line for several seconds because the woman threatening to make me tear down part of my legal home might have been living in one with a problem far larger than mine. The first thing I did after finding that note was nothing dramatic. I did not call Victoria, I did not post anything online, and I did not march into the HOA office with a folder under my arm. I made coffee, sat at my dining room table, and read every page of my own property records from beginning to end. If someone was going to accuse my home of violating standards serious enough to justify removal demands, I wanted to understand every line before responding. By midnight, the facts about my mansion were clear. The rear terrace had been included in the original architectural plans. The stonework matched the approved materials list. The desert landscaping had been reviewed by the county because the lot bordered a dry wash, and the final inspection certificate specifically noted that the protected drainage corridor remained undisturbed. The HOA had signed off on the exterior appearance years before I purchased the house. The documents were not vague. They were stamped, dated, and filed properly. The next morning, I called a land use attorney named Laura Bennett, someone recommended by the architect who had designed the home. Her office was in Scottsdale, filled with framed site plans, zoning maps, and photographs of desert properties that looked expensive enough to require their own legal teams. She listened quietly while I explained the sheriff's deputy delivering the civil notice, Victoria's demand, the alleged violations, and the odd note connected to Victoria's Ridge property. Laura did not smile when she heard that part. She only leaned back and said, "Before we discuss anyone else's house, we prove yours is compliant." That was exactly the kind of answer I needed. Over the next 2 days, Laura requested certified copies of every relevant county record, including building permits, inspection reports, drainage reviews, architectural approvals, and HOA correspondence from the original construction period. She also hired a licensed surveyor named Mark Ellison to verify the lot boundaries and drainage corridor in the field. Mark arrived at my property just after sunrise with equipment mounted in the back of a white truck, wearing a sun hat, dusty boots, and the calm expression of a man who trusted measurements more than arguments. We walked the rear terrace together while he compared physical markers against the recorded survey. The desert behind the house was quiet except for wind moving through Palo Verde branches and the distant sound of landscapers working several lots away. Mark placed temporary flags along the edge of the drainage corridor, then measured the distance from the terrace, retaining wall, and landscaping features. Nothing crossed the protected line. Nothing even came close enough to support Victoria's claim. "Your house is where the documents say it should be," he said. "I will put that in writing after I process the field data." Laura sent Victoria's attorney a brief professional response that afternoon. It included copies of my approvals, explained that the HOA demand appeared inconsistent with the recorded file, and requested the specific documents Victoria relied upon before threatening fines or removal. The response was polite, but it did not leave much room for performance. 2 days later, the HOA replied with a packet of community guidelines, committee notes, and photographs taken from across the wash. The photographs showed my rear terrace from awkward angles that made it look closer to protected land than it really was. None of the materials included a newer survey, a county violation, or a professional inspection contradicting my records. Laura circled the missing items with a red pen and said, "They have opinions. You have permits." That should have ended the matter, but of course it did not. Victoria called an emergency HOA meeting that evening. A neighbor who still liked me enough to be honest sent a summary afterward. According to him, Victoria stood in front of the board wearing a bright coral designer blazer, oversized gold jewelry, and the kind of confident expression that made people assume she knew more than everyone else. She told residents that enforcement existed to protect property values and that exceptions could weaken the entire community. She did not mention my certified permits. She did not mention Mark's survey. She did not mention that the sheriff's deputy had only delivered paperwork and had not endorsed the HOA demand. Instead, she made the situation sound like a test of neighborhood authority. That was the moment I realized this was no longer just about my terrace. Victoria had used the appearance of official pressure to make a questionable demand look stronger than it was. So the next morning, Laura and I went back to the county building office, not to argue, but to understand the note I had found about Victoria's own property. A records technician pulled the Ridge file, typed for several minutes, then frowned at the screen. "There was an unresolved review," she said. "It looks like the rear expansion was flagged for follow-up, but I do not see a final clearance in this folder." Laura glanced at me without saying anything. The accusation against my house was falling apart, but the paper trail behind Victoria's mansion was just beginning to open. The county building office did not feel like the beginning of a major discovery. It felt like any other public counter in Arizona, with beige walls, fluorescent lights, numbered windows, and people waiting with folders full of permits, contractor forms, and inspection requests. But when the records technician opened Victoria Langford's Ridge property file, the room suddenly felt much quieter to me. Laura asked for certified copies of the unresolved review note, the original rear expansion permit, the drainage corridor map, and any final clearance connected to the addition. The technician printed slowly, checked the screen again, and then said the sentence that changed the entire direction of the dispute. I can find the permit application and the preliminary inspection, but I cannot find the final approval. Laura kept her voice even. Was the project closed out? The technician shook her head slightly and explained that the file had been marked incomplete pending follow-up from the owner and contractor. That did not mean Victoria had done anything wrong by itself, but it meant her records were not nearly as clean as mine. We left the office with a stamped packet and a receipt, then drove straight to Laura's office. On the way, she reminded me not to jump ahead. Your house is the immediate issue, she said. We finished proving that first. Everything else has to be handled through proper channels. By the end of that week, Mark Ellison delivered his written survey report on my property. It confirmed that my rear terrace, stonework, retaining wall, landscape boundary, and drainage setback were consistent with the recorded survey and approved construction documents. The report included measured distances, field photographs, and a clean overlay showing the protected wash running well behind my improvements. Laura attached that report to a second response to the HOA and demanded withdrawal of the pay or remove notice. This time, Victoria's attorney called instead of sending a polished letter. I was in Laura's conference room when the call came through on speaker. He sounded careful, professional, and less confident than the HOA message had been. He said the board would review the material and reserve all rights. Laura replied that reserving rights was fine, but continuing to threaten enforcement after receiving certified proof would create a much different record. There was a pause long enough for me to hear papers shifting on the other end. He finally said the matter would be discussed at the next board session. That evening, Victoria sent a community update claiming the association was conducting a routine compliance review and that certain owners were attempting to challenge standards designed to protect Marigold Hills. She did not name me, but everyone knew who she meant. My phone lit up with messages from neighbors, some supportive, some nervous, and some asking whether the HOA could really make someone remove part of a house years after approval. I answered only the people I trusted and told them the truth. My records were certified, my survey was completed, and my attorney was handling it. The next new beat came from a retired county inspector named Glenn Parker, who called Laura after hearing about the dispute from someone still working in the building office. Glenn had inspected homes in Marigold Hills for years before retiring. He remembered Victoria's Ridge addition because it had been unusual, expensive, and built close to land that required special review. Laura invited him to her office. Glenn arrived with a worn folder of personal notes he had kept from old projects, not official files, but enough to point us toward the right questions. He said Victoria's original mansion had been approved, but the rear entertainment wing was a later addition with a covered terrace, expanded outdoor kitchen area, and a glass-walled room facing the desert preserve. According to Glenn, the county had asked for revised drainage calculations and confirmation that the expansion did not cross the approved disturbance limit. I remember waiting for the final paperwork, he said. Then the project just looked finished one day. He was careful not to accuse anyone. He only said he never remembered seeing a proper closeout. Laura asked whether he would sign a statement describing what he personally recalled, and he agreed as long as it stayed factual. The next morning, Victoria's attorney finally sent a revised position letter about my house. The association would suspend the demand while reviewing my certified records. It was not an apology, but it was the first sign that the pressure campaign against me had cracked. Then Laura placed the letter beside the Ridge property packet and Glenn's statement. Now we know the pattern, she said. Your approvals were complete, and hers may not be. I looked at the two files on her table, one clean and one full of gaps, and understood why Victoria had pushed so hard. If everyone kept staring at my mansion, no one would look up at hers. The first time I drove up toward Victoria's Ridge property with Laura and Mark, I understood why most residents had never questioned anything about it. Her mansion sat above Marigold Hills like a private resort, all pale stone, arched windows, iron balconies, and desert landscaping arranged so perfectly it looked less like a home and more like a statement. From the road, the rear expansion was partly hidden behind a curved wall, but the glass room and covered terrace still caught the sun from the slope behind it. Victoria had spent weeks telling people that my rear terrace threatened community standards, yet hers looked twice as elaborate and far closer to the protected desert edge than anything on my property. We did not enter her land. Mark parked on a public access turnout below the ridge and used the recorded plats, aerial imagery, and visible control points to compare the approved building envelope with what actually stood there. Laura reminded me that everything had to stay clean. No trespassing, no guessing, no dramatic confrontation, and no public accusations before the professionals finished their work. Mark took measurements from lawful locations, noted sight lines, and marked the difference between the original approved footprint and the later expansion shown in the county packet. The more he worked, the less he spoke. That was how I knew the file was getting serious. After an hour, he lowered his equipment and said, "The question is not whether the addition exists. The question is whether anyone ever approved where it ended up." That afternoon, Laura requested the full architectural archive from the original design firm and the contractor history from the county licensing office. She also sent a formal public records request for drainage studies tied to Victoria's parcel. By then, my own HOA violation had gone strangely quiet. The board had not withdrawn it completely, but they had stopped using the words immediate enforcement. That silence did not feel like peace. It felt like Victoria deciding which door to close before another one opened. 2 days later, a former subcontractor named Luis Ramirez agreed to meet us at a coffee shop near Old Town Scottsdale. He had worked on stone and exterior drainage during Victoria's rear addition years earlier. Luis was careful, nervous, and very clear that he did not want trouble with wealthy homeowners or the HOA. Laura told him we only needed facts. He explained that the original plans called for a smaller covered patio, but during construction, the rear design kept expanding. A glass sitting room was added. Then the outdoor kitchen wall shifted. Then the pool deck was extended toward the preserve view. He remembered county questions about drainage and disturbance limits because the crew had to pause while revised paperwork was supposedly being handled. "We were told it was taken care of," Luis said, "but I never saw the final sign-off posted after that." Laura asked whether he had photographs from the project. Luis opened his phone and showed old images saved in a cloud folder: framing, stonework, temporary stakes, drainage trenches, and a bright pink line in the dirt that he said marked the limit they had been warned not to cross. In one photo, the new foundation appeared beyond that line. Mark studied the image without reacting, then asked Luis if the photo location could be matched to the current property layout. Luis nodded and pointed to the ridge wall and a distinct saguaro still visible behind the mansion. That was a new beat none of us expected. It was not just a missing final approval anymore. It was a possible mismatch between the approved disturbance line and the actual construction. Laura did not celebrate. She simply asked Luis to send the photos with dates attached and sign a factual statement. That evening, Victoria appeared at another HOA meeting wearing a bright fuchsia blazer, large jeweled earrings, and a polished smile that looked prepared in advance. A neighbor sent me the recording because the board allowed remote viewing. Victoria told residents that certain claims against association leadership were distractions from the real issue of protecting Marigold Hills. Then an older homeowner asked whether every board member's property had fully completed approvals on file. The room changed. Victoria answered that she was not there to discuss personal attacks. Another resident asked why my house had been threatened before the HOA verified my permits. The board secretary looked down at her notes. Victoria's attorney leaned toward her and whispered something. For the first time, the residents were not simply listening to her. They were measuring her words against the same standard she had applied to mine. The next morning, Laura received the drainage archive. Inside was a stamped review sheet for Victoria's rear addition with 3 requirements: revised calculations, a final site inspection, and written confirmation that no permanent structure crossed the approved disturbance boundary. The last line was blank. The blank line on Victoria's drainage review sheet did not look dramatic, but Laura treated it like a locked door with the key missing. She placed the page beside Luis Ramirez's construction photographs, Glenn Parker's statement, and Mark Ellison's preliminary notes from the ridge turnout. then started building a timeline instead of an accusation. That was important because every piece had to show something different. The county file showed that final clearance was required. Glenn remembered that the project had not been properly closed out. Louise showed that the addition may have pushed beyond the line the crew had been warned about. Mark could connect the old plan to the current structure with measurements. None of those facts alone proved the full story, but together they made Victoria's confidence look less like authority and more like a curtain pulled over a window. Laura sent a formal packet to the county building office requesting a current site review of Victoria's rear expansion. She did not ask them to punish anyone. She asked them to verify whether the addition matched the approved plans and whether the final drainage requirements had ever been satisfied. The county responded faster than I expected because the open file was still sitting in their system as unresolved. A senior inspector named Denise Callahan scheduled a review for the following week, and because Mark had already prepared an overlay from public records, Laura submitted it as supporting material. Meanwhile, the HOA finally withdrew the immediate demand against my property, but the letter was written so carefully it almost avoided admitting anything. It said the association had elected to pause enforcement after receiving additional documentation. Laura read it once and smiled without humor. "They threatened your house first and verified later," she said. "That matters." The withdrawal changed the neighborhood mood almost overnight. People who had avoided me at the mailbox began stopping their golf carts near my driveway to ask quiet questions. One couple admitted they had received smaller compliance letters from Victoria over patio tiles and exterior lights. Another homeowner said the board had approved her landscape plan, then tried to fine her 18 months later after Victoria personally disliked the color of the gravel. I did not turn those stories into a campaign. I simply gave every person Laura's advice. Keep your records. Ask for the authority behind every demand, and do not confuse a confident letter with a valid order. The next beat came on inspection day. Denise Callahan arrived at Victoria's property with a county vehicle, 2 staff members, and a folder thick enough to make the HOA attorney look uncomfortable. Victoria stood near the front entry in a bright orange designer jacket, oversized pearl necklace, and white designer handbag, smiling as if this were a misunderstanding she planned to manage with charm. Laura, Mark, and I remained on the public side of the process because the inspection was between the county and the property owner. Still, from the road turnout, we could see the county team walk along the side path toward the rear expansion. They spent more than an hour behind the house. Mark watched quietly through binoculars only long enough to identify general movement, not private details, then looked back at his maps. When the county team returned to the driveway, Denise spoke with Victoria and her attorney for several minutes. Victoria's face did not collapse, but the smile disappeared. 2 days later, the county issued a written notice requiring additional documentation and correction options for the rear addition. The notice did not order immediate demolition. It gave Victoria a deadline to produce missing approvals, updated engineering, or a lawful remediation plan. That was how real enforcement worked. It moved through notices, deadlines, reviews, and opportunities to respond, not through dramatic speeches. Victoria responded by calling another HOA meeting, and this time the room was packed. She wore a bright turquoise blazer, large gold bracelets, and a look of polished frustration. She told residents that outside pressure was distracting the board from community business, but the board treasurer interrupted and asked whether the association had used HOA resources to pursue my property while ignoring open county questions on hers. The room went still. Victoria said her personal home was not relevant to association enforcement. Then a resident near the back said, "It becomes relevant when the same person signs the letters." That sentence traveled through the room like a door opening. Laura later received a copy of the meeting minutes, and for the first time, the board voted to appoint an independent compliance review committee instead of letting Victoria control the issue alone. By the end of the week, the story had changed completely. My mansion was no longer under threat, Victoria's addition was under county review, and the residents of Marigold Hills were beginning to understand the difference between leadership and pressure. Then Mark delivered his final ridge analysis, and the last page showed the clearest image yet. Part of Victoria's glass-walled rear wing appeared to sit beyond the approved disturbance boundary. Mark's final ridge analysis did not accuse Victoria of anything emotional. It did not call her dishonest. It did not mention the way she had threatened my home. And it did not care how expensive her mansion looked from the street. It simply placed the approved disturbance boundary over the current structure and showed that the rear glass wing and part of the terrace appeared to extend beyond the line that had been approved years earlier. Laura read the report twice before saying a word. Then she separated the pages into 3 stacks on her conference table. My resolve file, Victoria's open county file, and the HOA governance file. These are 3 different problems, she said. Your property was wrongfully pressured. Her property needs official review, and the association has to answer for how it used its authority. That was the clearest explanation anyone had given me. The next week moved fast, but not unrealistically fast. County Inspector Denise Callahan issued a follow-up letter asking Victoria for corrected engineering, proof of final clearance, or a remediation plan by a firm deadline. The Independent Compliance Review Committee requested copies of all letters sent under Victoria's signature during the previous 5 years. The board treasurer, a quiet man named Andrew Mills, contacted Laura to ask whether my attorney would provide a factual timeline of the demands sent to my property. Laura agreed, but only on the condition that the timeline includes certified records instead of opinions. I approved it because I wanted the community to see how easily a formal-looking letter could become a weapon when nobody checked the foundation beneath it. At the next HOA meeting, the atmosphere felt different before anyone spoke. Residents filled the clubhouse ballroom, not for cocktails or community updates, but because everyone wanted to know whether the rules had been applied fairly. Victoria entered wearing a bright yellow designer blazer, a silk blouse, oversized sapphire earrings, and gold bracelets that clicked softly every time she moved her hands. She still looked expensive, still looked composed, and still sat at the center of the board table as if the room belonged to her. But the room did not feel like hers anymore. Andrew opened with the Compliance Committee's preliminary findings. He explained that my property had received a severe enforcement demand before the association obtained a current survey, a county violation notice, or an independent architectural review. A low murmur moved through the chairs. Then he stated that several older enforcement letters appeared to rely heavily on board discretion rather than documented authority. Victoria immediately leaned toward the microphone and said the board had always acted to preserve property values. That phrase had worked for years. This time, a retired accountant in the second row raised her hand and asked, "Can property values be protected by sending letters that are not supported by records?" Victoria's expression tightened, but she answered that the association had to maintain standards. Another resident asked whether Victoria had disclosed her own unresolved county review before signing demands against other homeowners. Her attorney placed a hand near her papers, and for a moment she said nothing. That silence mattered more than any speech. Laura did not grandstand. When invited to speak, she walked residents through my timeline calmly. Original permit, HOA approval, county drainage review, final inspection certificate, marked survey, withdrawal of enforcement. She never called Victoria a liar. She only showed that the facts had been available before the demand was sent. Then she stopped, closed the folder, and returned to her seat. The board voted that night to suspend Victoria's unilateral enforcement authority pending a full governance review. She remained president for the moment, but every future compliance letter would require independent documentation and board approval. The vote passed by a narrow margin, and the sound of it seemed to drain the last performance from her face. The following morning, Denise Callahan's office scheduled a formal site verification at Victoria's mansion, this time with access to the rear structure and a requirement that her contractor provide the original construction drawings, revised plans, and any engineering reports claimed to exist. Victoria had until the inspection date to produce the missing documents. I expected her to settle quietly, but instead she sent a statement to residents saying she welcomed review and would prove her home had been targeted as part of a personal dispute. That line angered people more than it helped her because the issue no longer belonged to me. The county had the file. The board had the minutes. The residents had the timeline. A few days later, Luis Ramirez provided authenticated copies of his old construction photos, including the image with the bright pink disturbance line and the later foundation work beyond it. Glenn Parker signed his factual statement about the missing closeout. Mark prepared a supplemental exhibit matching the old photo landmarks to the current ridge layout. Each piece filled a different gap. By the time the inspection day arrived, Victoria's mansion no longer looked untouchable. It looked like any other property in Marigold Hills, subject to the same paperwork, the same lines, and the same rules she had tried to use against me. The morning of Victoria's formal site verification began with the kind of desert stillness that makes every sound feel larger than it is. I was not invited onto her property, and I did not need to be there, but Laura asked me to meet her at the public turnout below the ridge so I could understand what happened without interfering. Mark Ellison parked beside us with his survey truck, a stack of exhibits, and the same calm expression he had worn from the beginning. County Inspector Denise Callahan arrived at 8 o'clock with 2 staff members, a tablet loaded with the permit file, and a folder of certified review sheets. Victoria's attorney was already waiting near the front gate. A few minutes later, Victoria stepped out of the mansion wearing a bright magenta designer jacket, oversized gold jewelry, a cream handbag, and sunglasses large enough to hide half her face. She looked prepared, but not relaxed. Denise introduced the county team, explained the scope of the inspection, and made it clear that the purpose was verification, not argument. The sheriff's office was not present because there was no enforcement action that day, only an inspection arranged through proper notice. That mattered to me because everything about this case had to remain grounded in process. Denise and her team walked the side path toward the rear structure while Victoria, her attorney, and a contractor followed. From the turnout, I could see only pieces of the movement through the desert landscaping. A clipboard, a measuring pole, a staff member crouching near the terrace edge, Mark comparing his exhibits against the visible ridge line. Nearly an hour passed before Denise returned to the driveway and asked Victoria's contractor for the final revised drainage calculations. He produced a folder, but even from a distance, I could see the hesitation in the way he handed it over. Denise reviewed the pages, then asked for the final inspection clearance tied to the rear glass wing. The contractor looked to Victoria's attorney. Her attorney looked at Victoria. Victoria said something I could not hear, but her hands stopped moving. Later, Laura told me exactly what had been said because it appeared in Denise's written summary. The documents Victoria produced covered the original mansion and part of the early patio plan, but they did not include final clearance for the expanded glass room or the shifted terrace edge. Denise also noted visible improvements beyond the disturbance boundary shown in the approved drainage review. The county did not make a dramatic ruling in the driveway. Denise simply issued a field notice stating that the property was not in documented compliance and that Victoria had a deadline to submit corrected engineering, proof of legal approval, or a remediation proposal. Victoria tried to frame it as a paperwork delay. Denise responded that unresolved paperwork becomes a compliance problem when the structure is already built. That sentence traveled through Marigold Hills before lunch. By evening, residents were discussing not just Victoria's mansion, but every enforcement letter she had ever signed. The Independent Compliance Committee expanded its review, and Andrew Mills sent a message to the community explaining that all future enforcement would require verified evidence before penalties or removal demands were issued. The tone was careful, but the meaning was obvious. The board was separating itself from Victoria's style of leadership. Over the next 10 days, Victoria's options narrowed. Her engineer attempted to justify the existing structure, but the updated calculations showed that part of the rear expansion changed drainage assumptions near the protected desert edge. Her attorney proposed a retroactive approval, but the county required proof that the disturbance boundary could lawfully be adjusted, and the environmental review would not support that request as submitted. Laura stayed in her lane. She did not represent the county, and she did not control Victoria's case. She only monitored the record because Victoria's original demand against me was now part of a larger governance dispute. Then the county issued the notice everyone had been expecting, but nobody wanted to say out loud. Victoria was given a formal correction order. She could submit a permitted remediation plan to remove the non-compliant portions of the rear addition and restore the affected drainage area, or the county could pursue enforcement through the court. The order did not threaten her entire mansion. It focused on the unauthorized rear glass wing, part of the terrace, and the disturbed area beyond the approved boundary. That distinction made the story believable and somehow heavier. This was not a cartoon punishment. It was a precise correction for a precise violation. Victoria called an emergency board meeting the same night. But this time the meeting did not belong to her. Residents asked why my legal terrace had been threatened before review while her unresolved expansion had been defended as private. Andrew read the county correction order into the minutes. The board voted to cooperate with all county requests and removed Victoria from all compliance matters involving homeowners. She sat through the vote in a bright magenta jacket that looked louder than her voice had become. When she finally spoke, she said the process was unfair. A homeowner near the front answered quietly, "It is the same process you wanted for everyone else." No one cheered. No one needed to. The room had already changed. The correction order did not bring instant consequences, and that was what made it feel real. For the next several weeks, Victoria Langford's mansion remained exactly where it had always been, high on the ridge above Marigold Hills, catching the sunrise through its arched windows as if nothing had changed. But beneath that polished view, the paperwork was moving. County Inspector Denise Callahan required a full remediation proposal. Mark Ellison submitted his boundary exhibits into the county review file, and Victoria's engineer tried one final time to argue that the rear glass wing could remain with added drainage improvements. The county rejected that option because the issue was not just water flow. The addition had crossed a disturbance boundary that was tied to the protected desert edge, and the approval records did not support keeping it in place. Laura explained the difference to me in plain English. "They are not punishing her for being difficult," she said. "They are requiring the property to match what was lawfully approved." That mattered because I did not want the ending to look like revenge. I wanted the record to be so clear that even people who disliked me would understand why it happened. Victoria's attorney requested a hearing before the County Board of Adjustment, hoping for a variance that would legalize the rear expansion after the fact. The hearing filled a small county meeting room with residents, board members, contractors, and people who had never attended a public process until their HOA president became the subject of one. Victoria arrived in a bright royal blue designer blazer, a white silk blouse, oversized earrings, and a handbag that matched her shoes. She looked prepared to fight with posture alone. Her attorney argued that the addition had existed for years, that removal would be expensive, and that the home had become part of the visual character of the ridge. Denise presented the county file calmly. Incomplete final clearance, missing drainage confirmation, construction beyond the approved line, and no documented approval for the expanded glass room. Mark answered technical questions about the overlay and explained that his analysis relied on recorded plats, visible landmarks, and the approved disturbance boundary, not neighborhood opinion. Luis Ramirez's photographs were introduced as supporting historical evidence, and Glenn Parker's statement confirmed that the project had raised concerns before it was finished. The board listened for nearly 2 hours before denying the variance request. They gave Victoria a final deadline to submit a permitted removal and restoration plan. No one in the room celebrated. The decision felt less like a victory and more like a bill finally coming due. A licensed demolition contractor filed the plan 10 days later. The scope was narrower than the rumors spreading through Marigold Hills. Victoria's entire mansion was not coming down. The front structure, bedrooms, main living areas, and approved portions of the home would remain. The work focused on the rear glass wing, part of the covered terrace, a section of hardscape, and the disturbed area near the protected boundary. The contractor would remove the non-compliant sections, stabilize the site, restore drainage, and replace the disturbed landscaping with county-approved native plants. Sheriff Daniel Reeves was scheduled to be present only because residents had gathered at prior meetings and the county wanted the site kept orderly while heavy equipment entered the gated street. The night before the work began, I stood in my own driveway and looked up at the ridge. I thought about the first letter Victoria sent me, the one that tried to make my legal home sound like a problem that needed to be corrected by fear. I also thought about how easy it would be for people to twist the next morning into a story about revenge. Laura warned me not to speak to reporters, neighbors, or anyone looking for a dramatic quote. "Stand there if you need to witness it," she said. "But let the order speak for itself." At dawn, the licensed crew arrived with county permits displayed in the windshield of the lead truck. Sheriff Reeves parked near the entrance to Victoria's Drive. Denise Callahan reviewed the work area with the contractor, checked the marked removal lines, and confirmed that only the approved non-compliant sections were included. Victoria stood near the front steps in a bright red designer jacket and oversized jewelry, watching the same process she had once tried to demand from me without verified evidence. The first panels of the glass wing came down carefully, removed piece by piece under county supervision. There was no chaos, no shouting, no reckless destruction. There was only the steady sound of a lawful correction finally catching up to a house that had stood too long on incomplete approval. I did not smile when it started. I did not feel the rush people probably expected. I felt the weight of every document, every measurement, every meeting, and every resident who had learned that authority without accountability is just pressure dressed up as leadership. By sunset, the rear wing that had seemed untouchable was gone, and the ridge looked different in a way no one could ignore. By the next morning, Marigold Hills looked the same from a distance, but everyone who lived there knew something had shifted. Victoria Langford's mansion still stood on the ridge, elegant and expensive, with its pale stone walls glowing under the Arizona sun, but the rear glass wing was gone. The terrace edge had been cut back, and county-approved restoration fencing marked the area where native desert plants would be replaced. The work crew returned for several days, not to make a scene, but to stabilize drainage, remove debris properly, and prepare the disturbed ground according to the remediation plan. Denise Callahan inspected each stage, signed off only on completed steps, and made sure the correction matched the order instead of turning into something broader than the county had approved. That mattered to me because I never wanted the story to become one man's revenge against one woman's home. The truth was sharper than revenge. Victoria had used HOA authority to threaten my legal mansion before verifying the facts, while her own rear addition had been sitting on incomplete approval for years. Once both properties were measured by the same standard, the outcome spoke for itself. 2 weeks after the removal work ended, the HOA board held a special governance meeting in the clubhouse ballroom. Victoria attended in a bright lavender designer blazer, oversized pearl earrings, and a stiff expression that made her look more tired than proud. She was still the same heavy-set woman who had once commanded the room with polished confidence, but the room no longer moved around her voice. Andrew Mills presented the Independent Compliance Committee's final recommendations. Every future enforcement letter would require documented authority, a current inspection or qualified review when needed, and board approval before any homeowner received a demand involving fines, removal, or structural changes. The committee also recommended homeowner access to the evidence behind major violations, so no one would be expected to accept threats based only on a confident signature. The vote passed easily. Then came the final item, Victoria's role. She did not resign that night, but the board removed her from compliance oversight permanently and scheduled a leadership election for the following month. Some residents wanted a harsher ending. Others felt embarrassed that they had trusted her without asking enough questions. I understood both reactions, but I did not stand up to attack her. When Andrew invited me to speak, I kept it simple. I said my house had been approved before I ever bought it, and I had only asked the HOA to follow the same rules it claimed to protect. I said Marigold Hills did not need weaker standards. It needed honest standards. The room was quiet after that, not because people disagreed, but because the sentence landed in a place everyone recognized. A month later, a new board president was elected, and the first policy change was published before the holiday landscaping notices went out. Compliance letters became shorter, clearer, and attached to actual records. Homeowners started keeping better files. The county closed my complaint file with no violation. Victoria completed the restoration requirements on her property, and the ridge slowly began to look natural again, though the missing wing remained a visible reminder of what happens when authority outruns accountability. I saw Victoria once more at the mailbox pavilion near the main entrance. She wore a bright green jacket, large sunglasses, and a gold bracelet that caught the afternoon light. For a moment, I thought she might say something sharp. Instead, she looked toward the ridge and said, "I thought protecting the community meant controlling every detail." I answered, "Sometimes protecting a community means letting the records control the decision." She did not apologize, not directly, but she nodded once before walking away. That was enough. I returned home that evening through my long iron gate, past the terrace she had tried to make me remove, and for the first time in weeks, I sat outside and watched the desert turn copper under the sunset without thinking about notices, meetings, or legal deadlines. What stayed with me was not the sound of the demolition crew or the look on Victoria's face. It was the lesson behind all of it. A letter can look official and still be wrong. A leader can sound confident and still lack the facts. And a homeowner does not need to shout, threaten, or break the rules to fight back. Sometimes the strongest answer is a complete file, a calm voice, and the patience to let the truth reach the right desk. After hearing this story, what would you have done if an HOA demanded that you pay or remove part of your home, even though your records proved it was legal? Would you have pushed as far as I did, or would you have tried to settle quietly? Share your thoughts, because stories like this show how differently people see fairness when property, power, and reputation are all on the line. And if you enjoy realistic HOA stories where evidence matters more than arrogance, consider subscribing so you can follow the next case built on records, rights, and the kind of justice that does not need to be loud to be final.